Hello, and welcome to the Autistic Me podcast. I am Christopher Scott Wyatt, speaking as the Autistic Me. Joining us for this episode is travel expert Dawn M. Barclay, author of Traveling Different, Vacation Strategies for Parents of the Anxious, the Inflexible, and the Neurodiverse. Welcome to the podcast, Dawn.
Thank you for having me.
Before we begin our conversation, I want to offer some context. Many families with neurodiverse family members have experienced travel nightmares. As the parents of two neurodiverse daughters, my wife and I know all too well the challenges of traveling. Even before we had children, we limited our travels, occasionally driving to quiet state or national parks. Whether it's traveling for work, visiting family, or attempting to take a vacation, long-distance travel is a stress-filled, anxiety-inducing experience we seldom enjoy. Many autistic traits and other challenges make travel overwhelming. For me, airports, public transit, and crowded destinations cause sensory overload, no matter how carefully I prepare. More than once, I have left a conference early to return home, forfeiting deposits and fees. I've even paid for one hotel and then decided I needed to stay at another. The pandemic has reduced business travel, academic conferences, and provided a reason to avoid vacations and family visits. Now, as many families and individuals are transitioning back to past routines, travel is returning to pre-pandemic levels. Here in Central Texas, the Austin Bergstrom International Airport recently set new records for daily passenger boardings. There was a 6-hour traffic jam at the airport's departure gate on Monday, March 28th. With March 2022 setting records, airport officials are warning that summer and holiday travel may be difficult. The Transportation Security Agency reports nearly 750,000 more daily travels are passing through airports in the United States than just 1 year ago. For those of us who were already reluctant travelers, this isn't encouraging news. What does this rush back to traveling and vacations and business travel mean for neurodiverse families like ours? Thankfully, we have an expert to answer some of those questions. So on this podcast, welcome Dawn Barclay, who has a career in travel and is now a travel expert, columnist, and author.
Yes, I sort of do a lot of different things, but I grew up in the travel industry. My parents had one of the largest agencies in Manhattan for quite a long time. Then they branched out into short-term apartment rentals throughout Europe, and I worked with them throughout their many years. I worked on and off for 20 years for them before. In the middle, I was working as a travel columnist. I worked in many facets of travel, and now I'm a writer. And I still have a travel column, but this was a book I felt needed to be written.
As you mentioned that, one of the things that I have found as an autistic individual is that I still will work with travel agents. Mm-hmm. I know it's a lost art, but travel agents often know things better than just clicking on a website and hoping for the best.
Yeah, especially the ones that specialize in autistic travel. One of the things that made this book really possible to write, because I wanted to write it back in 2009, and it wouldn't have been possible at that time because I just didn't have the people to interview. The IBCCES, which is an accreditation and continuing education organization, created the Certified Autism Travel Professional designation. There are hundreds of agents who have that now, and that's what they specialize in. And the same organization created the certified and advanced certified travel centers, or autism travel centers, so that you know that where you're traveling to has a vested interest in learning about what autistic individuals need and how to address their needs.
The Certified Autism Travel Professional?
Yes, CATP.
So this is an agent, much like the experienced agents I would work with, who know which is the quietest hotel or the most family friendly, which places are possibly accessible and not accessible?
Yes, absolutely.
These are individuals you might want to work with as an autistic individual or the parent or caregiver of an autistic individual, because websites don't always give you the whole picture and Yelp reviews aren't really the best place always to go. So it's nice to know there are professionals who are certified and have the knowledge to provide those supports. So I'm glad that we can ground this discussion in the fact that there are travel agents who are certified autism travel professionals.
Yes, and I have the link to finding them in the book, and all of the agents that I interview in the book are CATPs, and you are benefiting from their experience.
Let's start off with the premise here of traveling different. For our family, though we may postpone travel or avoid travel, the reality is that most of us find ourselves having to travel for family, travel for business, in my case, traveling for academic conferences. And then if there are those families that enjoy travel for the adventure, as you mentioned, the world travelers. I know many, don't happen to be one of them, but I know several of them. So everyone ends up having to travel.
Yes.
And I can think of nothing that fills our family with dread more than how are we going to get from there to here?
Understood. I think that most families go through that. There are so many people. I believe there was a recent survey that showed that 93% of those who were surveyed said, yes, we would love to travel with our children who have autism if we just knew where to go. So there's a huge number of families with autistic children or with mood and attention disorders who just don't travel because they don't know how they're going to handle the meltdowns. They don't know where to go. They don't know how the vendors and the suppliers are going to address their needs, which is another reason I wrote the book, so I could bring those facts to their attention, to families' attention, so they might be able to travel where they felt they couldn't before.
Traveling with what they call an invisible disability is different than traveling with a wheelchair or a cane or some other physical accommodation that's more obvious. It's also different than traveling with a physical impairment. Even though autism itself, with sensory issues and other comorbid conditions, it is a physical disability for many of us. A lot of people were slow to recognize that autistic children, autistic adults have different travel needs. They would say, well, we have ramps. Well, the ramps are great for wheelchairs, and I appreciate ramps too, but the physical accommodations are a nice start, but there are other accommodations that are required for the autistic individual, the neurodiverse individual. And one of the things you start off with in that very first introduction is the growing focus on the needs of autistic individuals and the modifications appropriate to neurodiversity. Could you speak a moment about what those modifications might be that we're going to discuss during this half hour or so?
Sure. In some cases, it's creating videos so that the children can see in advance what they're going to be encountering. It could be the creation of low sensory areas with dimmer lights and quiet areas, so there's a place to recharge when they get overstimulated. There could be accommodations like being able to skip lines and not have to wait to get in. There are certain hours where there might be just less crowds, less noise, maps that show in amusement parks that would show where those quieter places are, all those sort of accommodations, as well as staff who are trained in what is needed. Just that understanding is so critical. I know that what you were saying before about invisible disabilities, a lot of the parents I spoke to said that one of their biggest fears is that when the child has an overload, a sensory overload, and might just break down, that they're scared that the onlookers will think, oh, that parent doesn't know how to take care of their kid, or that kid is just misbehaving, and not really understand that it was outside of the child's control. And there's a whole chapter in the book about how to deal with those onlookers and how various parents do so. And some of them just have their child assuming that it's not a total breakdown, but the person is looking at the child funny, say. The child goes over and smiles and says, I have autism, and let me tell you a little bit about that. Or sometimes I flap my hands, and isn't that great? And they've come to really accept themselves and share that, because a lot of the parents and the CATPs believe that half the battle is just spreading the information about what autism is and communicating what it is, so people increasing the understanding.
Let's start at the pre-planning stages.
Okay.
When I was going to take one of the daughters to Washington, D.C. for an academic conference, we began with the map. Here's where we're going to go. Here's where we're going to travel. Here's where we will stop. Such preparation is something you discuss early on. You call it setting the stage. And I think it's very important for not only individuals with neurodiversity like myself to have that plan and that structure, but we have to remember our children feel better and more secure when we do that pre-planning with them. How did the people you interview approach that? What were some ideas and suggestions for that pre-planning stage?
Some recommended always bringing the children into the planning so that they feel a part of it and they have a vested interest in the trip. And when you present ideas to them, like, should we do this or should we do that? The selection should always be things that you're okay with. So there's no surprises and you don't have to say, no, that's not going to work. So you only offer suggestions or options that are pre-approved. Working through social stories is important. Visual schedules is important. Any pictures that you can offer of where every place you're going. I mean, walk through this trip in your mind. From how are you going to handle the lobby? How can we avoid the lobby of a hotel? How can we avoid the check-in process at the airport? Can one adult stay with the child while the other one checks in? Maybe take the child to someplace quieter. Always preparing yourself with things like noise canceling headphones in every situation. And I break down travel into like minute details of what you should do. There's always noise canceling headphones, and there's always the go-to bag with fidgets, keeping sensory toys, keeping the child occupied, whatever's going to work. Everybody's traveling with electronics. Everybody's got the iPad and the iPod and something that's holding all their favorite shows to keep them occupied. There is also starting small in that you can do a lot of things locally. Aquariums and zoos. Well, those are little trips, but even a trip to a flea market or to a yard sale can be reframed as an adventure, as a treasure hunt. Eating in a local restaurant that might serve ethnic food might be an introduction to the child of different cultures and different types of food, and you're not investing a lot to try those foods because you haven't traveled. I mean, you've gone around the corner perhaps, or a local bakery that maybe works with, an Italian bakery that has Italian pastries is different. So you can introduce the child little by little to understand different cultures or understand that life is different for other people and maybe pique their interest to exploring that.
You mentioned what you can take with you. There's also the issue of what you can't take. When we strike out on a trip is we have to figure out what can be carried on, what can travel with us and what can't. I'm really sorry, but you can only take 2 or 3 stuffed animals. You can't take 20.
Yeah.
And so these things are difficult for a child to say what you can and can't take. And I think it really helps to go through that with the child and say, here's what we have room for, but you get to choose, but this is all the room we have is this bag. And those things are very important, like you said, to rehearse weeks in advance. So you don't want to be packing the night before and having a meltdown.
Yeah. How do you do it with your child to have them limited to maybe only 3 toys?
We start probably 2 weeks in advance. What are you going to choose? And make sure that they keep thinking about it because it'll change right up until that final minute. Mm-hmm. And as every parent knows, the favorite toy will change right into the day you leave. But I think that you do have to keep in mind that by giving them the choice, I think it eases them into it.
Yeah. Yeah. It empowers them. Yeah.
Yeah. And you do have to say, this is the bag we can carry on. There are 4 of us. This is it.
I will say that a couple of the suggestions that people offered just for this sort of thing is trains, because trains have a much more liberal baggage policy. And also car trips because you have all the room to bring whatever you need. So I think sometimes people opted for that if this is a big issue. Also camping, and I talk about all of that.
And one of the things we have done is we have used shipping services where we have shipped stuff either to our destination or from our destination back home instead of going through the hassle of carry-on or checked baggage. And this is a tip I think that most frequent travelers learn is you can ship stuff ahead. It'll be there waiting for you. And there are services that specialize in that. Mm-hmm. I think it's worth it just for the time saved of not waiting in their baggage area for 2 or 3 extra bags just to have the stuff at the hotel or at family houses or whatever. Having that stuff there when you arrive is convenient. Sometimes it saves the meltdown.
Great tip. It's going into the blog that's going to follow up for the book. I think you're such a treasure trove of tips.
I think anyone who's traveled through this before has learned the hard way what does and doesn't work. Let's talk about some of the stuff that you have here after setting the stage. You talk about different modes of travel, and you just did. You just mentioned some people travel better on planes, some on trains, some use bus trips. Every mode of transportation has its own pluses and minuses.
True.
For me, trains are very difficult, the vibrations and some of this stuff. I honestly wouldn't trade the convenience of a 1 hour flight for the 3 hour or the 3 hour flight for what it would take to travel by train from any major city in the US to another major city. I just can't imagine 5 days of travel.
No, I agree. But then there are some children that are the vibrations. I've got a really great profile of a child who has autism in England. And he's very well known among the Transport Sparks people, which is a Facebook group and a social group in England. And this kid adores trains, and he is very much pacified by the rocking of the train. And they talk about, a number of people in the book talk about how children love trains. Children with autism love trains because of the repetitive motion, and you know what to expect with the doors opening and closing. And there's some people who absolutely adore them, and knowing that they're going to get to go on a train might make it for them. It's like, that's the best part of the trip. Just like there are children who are plane spotters, and they have the plane spotting app, and they're just totally perseverate about, they're obsessed with planes. And so going on the plane is going to be the highlight of their trip. And it's really knowing your child and building your trip around the child and their interests. And I have a very long chapter. To me, it's the heart of the book, which talks about special interests, which some children will occupy 16 hours a day of their day, learning and becoming experts in whatever they're interested in, and building the trip around that. So if they're interested in trolley cars, I have a whole list of museums of trolley cars around the country, or race cars, or construction, or any of elevators. I mean, I found all these special interests, and then I list all the museums so that build the trip around the child, and you will have a happy child, and you have great memories. And perhaps knowing you're going to this museum makes taking parts of the trip you're not really excited about, whether it's the mode of transportation or the hotel inconveniences or whatever, and sort of makes them a little better because you're looking forward to this thing that feeds into your interests.
Explaining the modes of travel to the child I found it very difficult to explain the airport process to my children. Mm-hmm. Until they went through it, it was very hard to explain what was going on through the security line. Obviously, that was a difficult challenge. Getting to the gate, then boarding, waiting for all of these were real challenges that we had to work through and plan for. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Is this something that you recommend doing with social stories for all families, or are there better approaches than, okay, now you're going to stand in line and they're going to call how do you recommend explaining those?
There's an organization called Wings for Autism. Are you familiar with it? Which lets you actually experience going through the airport and going through and all the different processes before you actually fly, so that you've sort of had a dress rehearsal with the child. And even in cities that don't have Wings for Autism, which I don't believe Wings for Autism is happening right now because of COVID, but I do believe they said that they're planning to come back when things go back to normal. If you call the airline, some airlines will do this for you, let you come and they'll give you a tour of the airport. I mean, it's going to depend on the individual place you're going. I have people who say that if you're going on a trip that stops, has an intermediary stop, that you could research in advance and find out if there are low sensory areas at that intermediary stop, or an indoor playground or whatever, so that you have a way to not only blow off steam, but you can have the child looking forward to that because they've previewed that that's going to happen. The Wings of Autism, also TSA Cares, will assign somebody to you that will walk you through the airport. And so you'll have somebody that will help you through every stage of the process in case there is a meltdown. There's a whole section in the book about how to handle pat downs and how you don't have to have the child patted down and how to get around that. because I know that can be an issue for some children. The fact that you could walk with them and carry them through the X-ray area, all of that is explained. I think that you have to know what's going to happen and preview it for them, but I think that the Wings for Autism really helps as well.
I have generally opted whenever possible to do the travel by car, especially with the kids. And in this time, the situation that we're in with the pandemic, we don't know when the TSA is going to change mask requirements, but it applies to, at least locally, I know it applies to our trains and air travel. So we have opted, even on short distances, for cars in the past, and now there's even more reason to look at car trips. Car trips come with their own challenges, and you have a section on that. What are some of the suggestions for the successful automobile road trip?
Planning in advance. First of all, vehicle maintenance. Make sure your car is in good shape ahead of time so you don't have any nasty surprises along the way. Describe as much of the journey in advance as possible. You should make sure the car seat is installed correctly and minimize interior noise and map out the route to determine frequent stops, like at playgrounds and rest areas. Scheduling the journey to coincide with the child's routine is important and their rhythms. So if they sleep during the day and you want to get a lot of that travel done during the day while they're sleeping, it's a good idea. Avoiding peak travel hours when you're going to hit traffic and crowds. Let them suggest parts of the itineraries based on their interests. Again, it never hurts to have something for them to look forward to. And I also talk about buses as well. And for buses, you should really, just like in a plane, you should decide if you want the child to sit up front or in the back, what's going to work best. No matter how much, what way you travel, you're going to want to make sure you have lots of food with you and comfort items and electronics. One parent suggested having the toys right in the back of their seat so the child could reach for them. So because it's difficult to be handing them back. But then you have your own challenges, like if the child drops them and starts screaming, it's kind of hard to deal with that. Maybe you want somebody sitting in the back with the child in the back seat. And having interesting creative travel games. There's always like the travel bingo, and there's a list of different kinds of games that you can play with the child, and always praise and incentivize appropriate behavior. Make the kid feel like they're a champion for getting through it.
We have lived in a number of states and cities. As followers of the blog know, we moved to Texas from Pittsburgh, and one of the common vacations in Pittsburgh was to take the mega bus to New York City for Broadway shows. You can actually time it with Broadway's productions of sensory-friendly screenings and shows, and I know those were frequently on the weekends. Increasingly, there are activities. Travel destinations will plan that around. So I know the Megabus would actually run on schedules that hit those sensory-friendly Broadway shows. I will be honest, I've never been on a Megabus. Now, I assume it's just a normal bus that's just a little nicer than the old-fashioned Greyhound. So I assume that this is not a horrible way to travel, or friends wouldn't do it so often.
Yeah, I have to look into it. I hate to admit that I've tried to cover everything, and I know it's impossible. So if it wasn't mentioned to me by a parent or a travel professional, it might have to be added in the blog that will follow up the book.
It may be something where it's more popular in corridors like the Pittsburgh to New York, where I think that's a fairly short straight line, relatively speaking. And I know in California, buses were common to go to the casinos. So I'm sure the buses, they know what's popular. And certainly Broadway is a big destination.
Sure. I know that with buses, some people said they liked buses because there were frequent stops to go to the bathroom. But then there are the same issues that you might have on a plane, where the child might be kicking the seat in front of them or eager to run around. And you have to explain to the child why that's not going to work and find other things to occupy their attention.
And the final mode that you mentioned in your book, I have a lot of friends who have taken cruises, especially places like Alaska for the glaciers, because they're interested in nature. I have a friend who did a cruise that I believe it was Iceland. Cruises are something that families do take. I will admit, when I have been in Tampa or other cities, I am fascinated by the vessels. The cruise ships are an amazing sight.
I grew up cruising, so I'm very pro cruise. My mother did not like to fly, so we used to travel transatlantically all the time on ships, and then I just kept cruising. So,
do they still have transatlantic?
Yeah, sure they do. It's not the Queen QE2 anymore. I did the QE2 a lot, but yeah, they still have some.
When we think cruises now, I think of here in Texas or in Tampa, where it's the 3 or 4 day cruise, maybe in Southern California, where it goes down to Mexico and back. So it's more like a floating hotel that's just making a whole lot of stops.
Yes.
Is that incorrect?
No, it's not incorrect. There are cruises anywhere from 2 days to like weeks and weeks. And that's the great thing about cruising is once you know your child and you know your family, you can decide on the destination and the length of the stay and the size of the ship. And there are some travel professionals who think that you should go on a very small ship because it's easier to handle, whereas other travel professionals will say go to one of these mega liners like the 5,000 passenger ships because it's so much larger and the people tend to congregate in smaller groups and there'll be more diversity to bring. If your child doesn't like it here, then take them there. And there'll be many more activities to keep them busy. So it's really going to depend on the child. I mean, there are some travel professionals who say that, if you just want to be the only people on board, rent a houseboat or rent a yacht and have the crew. And, you have the space to bring along people to help you. Family members or friends, they can pitch in and help. And if you have your own crew, then they can cook the foods your child likes. On a large vessel, you're usually going to find so many different types of food on the at the buffet. You're not going to have to worry. And then the dining goes anywhere from very casual, like eating by the pool, to buffets, to a formal dining room. So there's so much choice. Also, with cruises, you have organizations like Autism on the Seas, who run cruises specifically for people with autism. They are usually smaller groups on a larger ship, and you'll either travel with other families that have similar situations and they're accompanied so they can take care of everything and you'll have somebody to turn to, or they can arrange it so everything's organized for you, even if it is not a group trip, even if it's just your family traveling on their own. But what you're going to want to do with cruising is choose a cabin that's going to minimize noise and motion. You may want to consider a larger cabin or 2 adjoining cabins if your child's going to need more space. You're probably going to want to avoid a cabin with a balcony if you can't provide precautions to ensure the child can't access the balcony alone. Though there are alarms you can purchase to put on the interior doors of the cabin. The muster drill can be an issue for children. You have to see if it's really required because it's very chaotic for a child to go through the lifeboat drill where everybody, it's just people running around in different locations and it's crowds and you have to worry about the life jacket. And that's sort of, if you're on an Autism on the Seas crew, they minimize the chaos for you. And again, you're going to want to have noise canceling headphones. You're going to want to look into what's going to alleviate motion sickness. If your child's on a cocktail of medications, you're going to want to find some holistic remedies. And I list those. And another thing is when you're in port, because cruises might be that you're in port every day, or there might be some that you're 5 days at sea. That's going to depend on what you want to do. But when you're in port, you should be careful to select excursions that are going to be in tune with your child's needs. Or even better, you may decide to stay on board because there'll be very few people on board, and that's when you can enjoy a lot of the amenities without crowds.
And crowds are the biggest issue for my daughters. I know the youngest, anything that's crowded is going to be overwhelming, too noisy, especially with echoes. A lot of hotels aren't really, especially echoey lobbies and large spaces that have a lot of echo. And then you get large crowds in those spaces and it becomes difficult. So when I think of cruising, I think of what you see on television where they have, shows and buffets and crowded restaurants. And I'm thinking, wow, there's everything we avoid. Crowded restaurant, lots of people. But you mentioned smaller cruises. And I know that when my friends who cruise have done some of these nature cruises, that they've been smaller vessels without Broadway shows, you're not going to go swimming in Alaska, on the pool.
Yeah, that's true. Something like the Galapagos, you might take a cruise if you can endure the trip because it's quite a long trip depending on where you're located. And then you're dealing with the zodiac. So when you get off the ship, you have to get to port and you have to go on these dinghies. And there's the question of how your child's going to react to that. Again, you have to know your child.
And this is something that, again, these certified autism travel professionals would know if you worked with them and said, my child doesn't like loud spaces. We need minimal people,
yes,
controlled environment.
Yes, they have studied all the different hotel chains that specialize in autism and all the different cruises. And there are like 5 or 6 cruise lines that specialize in travel for people with autism. In fact, Royal Caribbean was one of the first to do this. And I actually list in the book a chapter which lists everything that they do for the population.
Moving along, I appreciate your time on this, and I want to kind of hit all the highlights that we can.
Can I backtrack just 1 second? Because you mentioned something that's really important, and that was you were talking about hotels and echoes and things like that. For families like that who can't deal with all that noise and the chaos, they often opt for a vacation rental where they're the only family there. Maybe they're renting a condo, something like that, or a villa. And they're the only family there, so they don't have to worry. But also, if you are in a hotel, and I have a whole section on this, some families bring a fan so that they can block out some of the noise from the hallway and people passing by, and they'll decide not to be near an elevator, or they'll ask for a room far from the elevator where it's quieter.
This would sound like a good opportunity for the bed and breakfast or the Airbnb. Mm-hmm. Some of those rental options where you can rent a space from either, I guess there are services as well as individuals, but that seems like a good option for those that want to have a little more control over the environment than a hotel might offer.
Yes. The only thing to be careful of there is some CATPs will not recommend those only because there isn't a standardized level of service, and they do vary.
The option that my wife and I have adopted for travel is usually, like, as I mentioned in the introduction, a state park, a national park, somewhere that's less crowded than a theme park or an amusement park, something that's less tourist destination, also off season. We always like the off season. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned in the chapter of where you're going, you mentioned camping, RVs, nature destinations.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that it's actually mentioned ahead of some of the tours and venues and restaurants, because for us, that would be our first choice.
Sure.
What do you recommend for families, and what did some of your discussions lead to with regard to camping and the outdoors, or options to camping? Yosemite, where you can rent, but you're not going to get luxury. You're going to get a place to stay.
Right. Well, so you know your family best, so you're going to have to decide how you want to camp. Are you going to want to be in a tent, a cabin, a pop-up camper, or an RV? And each has its advantages. For someone like me, glamping, which is luxury camping, would be a lot more preferable than roughing it. So I think there are probably some parents that are like that too. So a lot of times you can preview the campground via website and video, and you should be aware of the possible sensory issues that you can encounter. And I have a whole list of what those are. In fact, if you hold on a second, I will read a section. There was somebody who wrote a terrific thing that I reprinted with permission. In Your Autism Guide's 2019 Guide to Camping, Angela Zizak describes the potential sensory assault of campgrounds, such as, and I'm quoting, the smell of the campfire and fuels from the cars driving by, and the pungent smell of the closest outhouse, the sight of the fire lighting up the night, or games and other social activity between people at different campsites, the sounds of nearby site conversations, kids yelling to each other on their bikes, loud diesel trucks going by, birds and other animals, dogs barking, etc. New tactile sensations like camp pads made up of gravel rocks with some dirt or grass, or others made of concrete. Handling wood or sitting on a rough picnic table. Though, if your spectrum child likes deep pressure, swing hammocks are a perfect way to relax. And the taste of different waters, unless you bring your own. So those are all the things that, might be an issue. So start small. First of all, you're going to want to preview your campground via website or video. You're going to start small by maybe even camping out in your backyard or a local campground for a night to try it. If you start in an RV, make sure there are a lot of distractions for your child. If it becomes claustrophobic, you can break up the holiday and stop in a hotel or Airbnb on the way. The beauty is that you're in charge. I include a questionnaire of things to ask before booking a site. If you're tent camping, you're going to want to choose a campground that provides bathroom facilities and steer clear of any of them near water if your child can't swim. You're going to put safety first. Make sure your child wears an identity bracelet or sew a GPS locator into his or her clothes. Emphasize safety rules before departure and throughout the trip. And there's a lot of excitement that comes with camping. So you can play up unusual sleeping bags or the sort of cool stuff you're going to eat on the cookout, because you're not exactly making s'mores all the time at home over a campfire. So that's something that you could really play on. Have a set of camping rules and chores for children so they feel involved. And there are, as you probably know, freebies and deep discounts for camping families with neurodiverse members. And I don't know if you ever did any geocaching when you were traveling, but that's kind of a fun thing for them to do while they're camping as well. And it's something they may want to continue when they get home.
Our girls are in Girl Scouts, and geocaching is one of the badges.
Oh, there you go.
That works real well for Scouts.
Yeah.
I do want to offer a bit of an aside here, and that's as we're talking about sensory issues, we often forget that as we grow up, we get acclimated to the sounds and the sensory inputs from around us, which is why an autistic individual like myself who grew up in the country has a very difficult time in the city. And when I list all of the things that are bothering me, friends who are from the city say, I don't hear that. I don't know what you're talking about. What do you mean? Then I take someone who's been in the city and you take them out into the country, the high desert, or you take them here in West Texas, every little sound of the chirping crickets, the birds, what is that crawling that I hear? What are all those lights in the sky? And you really never think about it, but we become acclimated. And that's one of the things where when I talk to parents about sensory processing issues, what they're forgetting is when therapists say you can slowly acclimate to things, that's actually what we all do as we grow up. When you're born in a city, all those sounds you hear growing up in that apartment or that house in the city become your normal sounds.
Yeah.
And when you grow up in the country, those are your normal sounds. So when we think about this as families, you need to think about what are the sounds and the senses that your child is accustomed to. It is not that the country is different or the city is different. It's that you have adopted whatever you have been living with, and that becomes the norm. I am astounded. My wife can sleep through trains. Trains go by, doesn't bother her at all. Well, she lived in Sacramento, California, went to college there, and lived probably 20 feet from a rail line that was an Amtrak line connecting the Bay Area to Sacramento. So it was a commuter line. I have friends who grew up in Chicago who live near the L. They just sleep through it. I hear a train 5 miles away and I'm awake. What in the world is that horrible noise?
Yeah.
And so we forget that we have acclimated to those sounds that are in our sort of our background noise.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. Like, for example, you figure you're going to take your kid to the beach who's never been to the beach before, but you don't realize that they may not like the feeling of sand. And so maybe you go to, a local craft store and you buy some sand so that they can step on it at home. Or you're traveling, say you live in Florida and you're going to Alaska. Your child has never worn layers of clothes. So maybe you want to practice at home wearing layers of clothes so you're not doing it for the first time when you're on the trip.
I will say one reason we moved to Texas is after Minnesota and Pennsylvania, I am very sensitive to clothing. I'm extremely sensitive. I hate gloves, hats. I just can't. Gloves, and I'd rather have my fingers bleed from the cold, dry air. And that's literally what they would do is they would bleed when we lived in Minneapolis. My hands were always bleeding because I couldn't put lotion on because of the sensory overload, and gloves are awful. People forget when you travel, you do have to expect that it's going to be different. When I took the girls to Texas for the first time before we moved here, they complained about the heat, and now they complain about the cold somewhere. So I think it's important. You got to get the child aware that you're going to need different clothes. You might have different needs if you're traveling to a different climate. Maybe dress up.
Yeah.
Put on the coat, put on the gloves, get used to them. It's really important. I found that there's only really one good pair of gloves I like. They're nice suede lined, they're padded. I can wear them. They're not mittens. It's important. Find what your child can wear and won't be trying to pull off.
Yeah, actually, I have an anecdote of one parent who said, when she was traveling, she dressed her child up. She called her child her mini-me, and she put on her favorite little flip-flops. And she couldn't understand why whenever the child was on the ground walking, she would start screaming. But when she lifted the child was fine. So she just thought the child was being oppositional. And when they got to the hotel, her child threw those flip-flops off and was rubbing between their big toe and their next toe. And then she realized that the child is fairly nonverbal, so couldn't tell her that it was bothering her. And she felt really badly about it. But then she investigated and found some shoes she really liked that the child liked.
I had that experience. I bought sandals while I was in Florida thinking, I could wear these to the pool. Found out that it really hurt. I had to find something that had the strap that goes over the foot.
Yeah.
And again, these are little things that parents learn the hard way. I've learned the hard way. I think we all do. You talk about tours.
Yes.
Having someone who knows where they're going and what to do. There are autism-friendly tours and tour groups. There are ways to do tours that work well. Can you explain to the audience how you can find the right kind of tour and the right kind of group that you can do as a family with a neurodivergent family member?
I actually found very few tour companies that dealt with families, autistic families. Very few. I was looking for them. I found one, Wilderness Inquiry, which did have tours, nature tours for people of varying abilities. I did find camps where you could send an older child, but there are some CATPs who are trying to organize small group tours for those with autism. But it's important that those tours are based around dealing with the child as opposed to for the parent. Like I just heard about a cruise, and it's a luxury cruise line. I don't want to mention the name of the cruise line, but they were putting together a cruise to an exotic area that would have taken a very long time for people to travel to. And when we read the inclusions, they were really based for the parents to not feel so alone as opposed to being very child-centered, which is not going to work very well. I did send the description of the trip to two of the CATPs that I had relied on pretty heavily throughout the interview process. Although I think I interviewed about 50, but there were a couple that were more knowledgeable, the most knowledgeable. And so I sort of relied on them a lot. And they agreed with me that this was not a trip that they could recommend. So you have to be very careful if you see a tour company that's advertising autism friendly, that they really are going to be centered around what the child needs as opposed to just giving the parents some companionship of people in the same situation.
Traveling as a family, I want our trips, our adventures to be for the family as a whole. That means including the children in the discussions, in the planning, thinking about their needs instead of just what I want to do. And you address this and you talk about how the planning, the traveling, the destination, these do have to be child-centered or autistic-centered. If it's not a child, maybe you have a teen or a young adult. Mm-hmm. As my poor wife has, the autistic husband. And so those things have to be considered because you don't want to get there and find out it's not a good experience.
Right. It has to be everybody's trip. And again, that's one of the reasons I included the list of museums that would cater to special interests, because then I felt, say you're going on a business trip to a state that you wouldn't necessarily think might be autistic friendly, but there are enough venues that are certified autism centers that will address what you need, that you could build a trip around that. If Pennsylvania was one, there were different destinations in Mesa, Arizona is a great destination. We're the whole destination is autism certified. So there are restaurants and hotels and venues, museums that are all catering to the autistic community. And there are various locations like Myrtle Beach. There are definitely locations that you can go to where you're going to be taken care of. But then again, if your child has a specific interest, you should really base your travel around that, to cater around that, because then everybody's going to have a good time. It's going to be easier for you if you're a neurotypical parent to have a good time if you know your child's having a good time and building memories and you're creating a strong bond.
For our family, the challenges obviously are even greater at this time during the pandemic, and hopefully that fades. We try to do things that are educational and that do fit in with what the girls want to learn. Mm-hmm. And I think that has really helped us shape our travels in the past that we were able to take around those interests. When we were in Washington, D.C., I made sure that we went to the Children's Museum, the Smithsonian, the Museum of Natural History. I know those sound obvious, but our oldest, she is into science. Science is her life. That's what she wants. So it wasn't so much I wanted to go to an art museum, but that she wanted to go to the Natural History Museum. We went to the Natural History Museum, and I still get a little bit of what I wanted to do, but the important thing was to see just the sheer joy of her at the Smithsonian and at the national museums. And I know it's not easy for families to do and make those compromises. And you might plan a second trip where the other child gets to do what he or she wants. And I don't know, I find that it's often a good reason to go back to somewhere as the things you didn't get to see.
Absolutely. I know one family who talked about how they went to a mustard museum. Their child was in love with mustard, so they went to the mustard museum, and that's all he'll talk about now is how they went specifically for him and what a great time he had. So I had oddball museums included as well. My kids went to the Mutter Museum and loved it in Philadelphia, and that's full of pickled brains and body parts. It's like a surgical museum, but they still talk about how much they enjoyed it. And I also talk a lot about in itineraries, there are certain sports that are of interest and are therapeutic to children on the spectrum, golf and skiing and scuba. And I have experts talk about why those are therapeutic and where you can go to further your interest in those and build a trip around those.
The links to Traveling Different, Vacation Strategies for Parents of the Anxious, the Inflexible, and the Neurodiverse will appear in the show notes and on the Autistic Me blog. This is a complete book. You tried to cover a lot of material in one book.
Yeah, I'm pretty obsessive. I had to cover everything, and yet today you showed me all the things I left out.
Yeah, and so you're going to be expanding this, you said, with writing on your blog?
Yes, I've got the Traveling Different blog. There's not a lot on it now, but there will be, as I believe that people will write to me and say, you said this, but it's changed and I want to update. I want to keep updating the book. Or they'll bring in personal experiences that I did not cover. And I relish having that because I'd like to be as complete as I can. So you and I will be speaking, and I'm going to do a story about your experiences, which I wish I'd had before I wrote the book.
They're not always positive, and I know I'm not alone as a special needs parent saying that. It can be a challenge. What will the blog be?
It'll be travelingdifferent.com. Part of, I have Dawn Barclay Inc. is my website where I put a lot of my nonfiction. I have my portfolio on there, and I'll be updating. It's a section of that website, and that's separate from my fiction website.
Now, you grew up around travel. Travel is important to you and your family.
Yes.
A lot of families like mine dread travel. I have friends in the travel industry. One of my best friends is a travel agent who has retired, constantly trying to convince us you can do it. It is possible. It is feasible. Is that what you're trying to tell us too, is that it is possible? We could go out and see and do more after this pause here we've taken for COVID?
That's why I wrote the book. I wanted a book like this in 2009 because I had children that were inflexible and anxious and difficult to travel with. And I had grown up traveling, and it was my dream to share that with them. I wasn't about to stop traveling. And so I was shocked that there wasn't a book like this. And there still isn't. Many years later until now, there might be smaller, narrower focus, like cruising with a wheelchair, or cruising with autism, or one family's individual experiences, which is great. And as much information as there can be, the better. But I wanted to write sort of the ASD travel Bible. And I'm kind of hoping that this is what it is. And if a family travels that didn't think they could travel, but they find through reading the book that they can travel, and they send me a note, I mean, that's going to be the greatest joy for me, is getting that kind of feedback.
I want to thank you for being on the podcast. Again, Dawn M. Barclay, she is a travel expert, a columnist,
Yes.
a mother of two.
Yes.
And she will be updating Traveling Different on the Traveling Different blog. And I want to thank her for being on the Autistic Me podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.